decent person is horrified by what happened yesterday in Parkland. Every thoughtful person knows something horrible is going on in American society. Tragedies like this happen for a reason, and it probably doesn't have a lot to do with guns. The percentage of American households with firearms has dropped dramatically over the past 35 years. Meanwhile, the number of mass shootings has risen. If you're over 40, you did not grow up in a country like this. So the question is, what happened? It could be a lot of things. Far more Americans than ever before take psychiatric medications. Are outbursts of violence a potential side effect? We don't know, but it's possible. Does the social atomization of modern society play a role in all this? Well, spending life online does cause alienation. We know that. Last week, we interviewed author Johan Hari, who has studied the dramatic rise of depression in this country. As he pointed out, the most common answer to the question, how many close friends do you have, is now zero. A lack of meaningful relationships does cause despair. Perhaps in rare cases, it drives some to mass murder. Meanwhile, the nuclear family has collapsed nationwide. Does a generation of boys growing up without fathers pose a threat to this country? Of course it does. Why wouldn't it? Fatherlessness is one feature common to many mass shooters. Nobody's surprised by that. And what about men more broadly? As a group, men are not thriving in this country right now. Ignore the propaganda, and there's a lot of it, and instead look at the numbers. Men kill themselves more, graduate less, and of course commit pretty much 100% of mass shootings. It's a disaster, which for some reason our elites persist in ignoring. In March, this show will begin a month-long series every Wednesday on what is happening to men. We hope it'll be interesting. But why haven't we been talking about this for years? Now, we're not saying any of these factors caused the massacre we saw yesterday. We don't know that. We are saying we ought to do our honest best as a nation to figure out what exactly is going on here. But we're not doing that. That vital conversation has been drowned out and made impossible by mindless screeching about gun control, led by blustery charlatans in the media, you know exactly who they are, and also in Congress, whose only real agenda is moral preening. They aren't trying to solve the problem. Their aims are darker than that. Press a little bit and you'll see it. Sensible gun reforms, you hear that phrase a lot. You heard it all day today on cable news. What exactly does that mean, sensible gun reforms? Banning bump stocks? No. A piece on Vox.com today calls for a landmark gun control bill like the one Australia passed 22 years ago in 1996. That's the law that liberals are always telling you about. But the Australian law wasn't gun control, and it wasn't a voluntary buyback, no matter what they tell you. It was gun confiscation, a wholesale mandatory disarmament of the entire civilian population. Imagine what would happen if you tried that here in this country. America is not Australia for a bunch of reasons, including our history and our Bill of Rights. Imagine federal officials marching from house to house, seizing hundreds of millions of firearms from law-abiding citizens, and then fining and imprisoning those who resist. Vox approvingly calls this leadership. In fact, it's a recipe for bloodshed and civil war. It's nuts. Yet it is a common fantasy on the left. Dan Pfeiffer was a senior advisor to Barack Obama. Now he's a contributor at CNN, of course. Last fall, Pfeiffer wrote an article attacking his fellow Democrats for what he bluntly called fake moderation on guns. His advice was this: stop pretending to respect the Constitution and instead focusing on appointing judges who will nullify it. The goal? Gun seizures, ammunition regulation, the disarmament of the American population, a country where only the people in charge have guns and everybody else obeys. In the wake of yesterday's shooting, Pfeiffer's piece is going viral on the left. What he wrote is what they believe. So let's stop lying about this. The calls you're hearing today for gun control have nothing to do with protecting Americans from violence. What you're witnessing is a kind of class war. The left hates rural America, red America, gun-owning America, the America that elected Donald Trump. They hate them. Progressives are still in charge of most of the major institutions in this country, and they despise the autonomy of an armed population. They want collective punishment for the sins of a few. They seek to obliterate a core constitutional right rather than trying to mitigate its downsides. They call it gun control, but it's not. It's people control. For the left, voters who can't be controlled can't be trusted. So why have we seen such a massive increase, what seems like one, in shootings like this? Tom Kirsting is a psychotherapist and school counselor. Judge Alex Farrar is a former Miami-Dade County judge, and they both join us tonight. Judge, to you first. We're going to find out a lot more in this specific case because unusually the shooter is still alive. But more broadly, we have seen, in absolute terms, a pretty big spike in shootings like this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, it'd be very difficult to just go ahead and jump into the mind of these shooters and come up with a very simple explanation for why they're behaving that way. Clearly, society has changed in its relationship with violence. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, there was nowhere near the level of violence we have today. We certainly had guns back then, but we didn't have the level of violence we have today. So I think in some ways, society has become very desensitized to violence. And I did see back then as a police officer, parents taking a much more key role in educating their kids about right and wrong. We seem to have lost that line of distinction between right and wrong. Not to say that that clearly applies to this case, because nobody would ever think that it's right to do this horrific act. But I think, like Mayor Giuliani discussed, it's the little things that lead to the big things. And as a judge, I used to tell the parents who come in my courtroom, you can either discipline your child now, or somebody like me is going to be disciplining them much later. And that discipline is going to be a lot harder to deal with, because it is a rolling stone. And once it starts moving, you know, culture does change. And we see culture now being very violent, very, I would say, desensitized to it, where it doesn't faze them anymore.
Clearly. I mean, Tom, guns are not magic. They're tools. They don't operate themselves. Attitudes are what matter, and attitudes have changed. How have they changed, do you think?
Well, here's what I think, Tucker, right? So the society we live in is not the society I lived in growing up as a kid. This generation is being raised by social media and smartphones, and they're not spending enough time part of the family dynamic. And the kind of content, we see it. I mean, if you go on social media, whether it's just, you know, the hatred from, you know, people's views and so forth, we see this anger and this hatred that's occurring, that's getting into people's minds. That takes somebody who's mentally ill, like the shooter, okay? Imagine him absorbing hours and hours a day of video content, which is what I would presume he did, and I think we're going to see that. I really believe that. And imagine what that's doing to his mind, all right? Our actions as human beings are a reflection of what's spinning around upstairs in our minds. So we got to get back to the basics of families. Parents need to sit down with their kids every night, get back to the dinner table, and have what the president said today, deep, meaningful interactions with one another.
I think that sounds right. Judge, why isn't there a national conversation about this? It seems like something that's important, and it's an obvious problem, and people feel like there's something deeply wrong with the culture that would produce something like this, but there isn't a conversation about it. Why?
I don't think it's something you can control. I think it's a lot harder to get people to change the way they're living their lives than it is to say, you know, if we just banned this type of gun, this problem would go away. And the reality is that if somebody is a homicidal maniac, if somebody is, and I completely agree with the doctor, that the sentiment out there gets created, especially in social media where there's so much hatred in today's day and age, it becomes a triggering effect. At some point, somebody snaps. So if somebody snaps and they want to kill a lot of children because they think, you know what, I'm going to become infamous, you don't need a gun to do that. Just sitting here talking to you, I can think of 3 ways right now that I could kill a lot of children if I was a homicidal maniac, and none of them would involve guns. So it's an easy answer. It's easy to say, let's ban guns and we've solved the problem, or let's ban this type of gun, because I don't think the U.S. will ever, having been founded with the Wild West, having been founded with guns, would ever get rid of all their guns. It's easy to say that. It's a lot harder to get people to change their behavior and the way that they are raising their children, and especially the way society's been kind of moving away from religion, which, like it or not, did set moral parameters for people and teach right and wrong. The other answer is a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree with that. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thanks, Tucker.
Thank you.
The Parkland shooting appears to have happened despite some advance warning. It turns out 5 months ago, the FBI was tipped off in a way that a YouTube commenter was discussing his intent to be a professional school shooter.
And how did the FBI respond?
They responded pretty immediately. I had a field agent contact me and meet me at my office the very next morning, and unfortunately I wasn't able to provide them with much.
Well, you gave them the user's name, right, which is the same exact name as the shooter.
I'm sure had more time and effort been put into finding out who the username belongs to, if that's even possible. I don't know how many Nicholas Cruzes there are on YouTube, but they would have been able to find out who this person was.
But as you heard, the FBI was not able to identify Cruz.
In 2017, the FBI received information about a comment made on a YouTube channel. The comment simply said, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." No other information was included with that comment, which would indicate a time, location, or the true identity of the person who made the comment. The FBI conducted database reviews, checks, but was unable to further identify the person who actually made the comment.